The town of Bitter Creek thought it was the ultimate cruel joke. Send the scarred, unwanted daughter to the terrifying recluse on the mountain instead of her beautiful sister. They expected her to return, broken, or not at all. They never expected the mountain man to make her a queen. The Wyoming wind howled through the dusty streets of Bitter Creek, but it was nothing compared to the chill inside the Prescott home. Josiah Prescott, the town's wealthiest and most ruthless merchant, sat at his oak dining table, his eyes fixed on a heavy leather pouch that clinked with the unmistakable sound of raw gold. Across from him stood Silas Montgomery. To the town, Silas was a myth made flesh, a towering mountain man who lived high in the treacherous peaks of the Wind River Range. Clad in thick bear fur and buckskin, with a heavy beard and piercing, storm-gray eyes, he looked every inch the savage they whispered he was. He had come down from the mountain for supplies, but he had laid that bag of gold on Josiah's counter for something else entirely. A wife. Silas had pointed a calloused, dirt-stained finger at Clara Prescott, Josiah's youngest daughter, who was widely considered the most beautiful woman in the territory. Clara was a vision of golden curls and porcelain skin, spoiled rotten by her father's wealth. Josiah, blinded by the sheer weight of the gold that would save his failing mercantile business, had agreed without hesitation, but Clara refused. She threw a violent tantrum in the parlor the moment Silas left to prepare his wagon. "I will not go to that beast," she screamed, throwing a porcelain teacup against the fireplace. "He smells of pine pitch and blood. I'd rather die than be trapped in some freezing hovel with a monster." Josiah, desperate to keep the fortune, hatched a sinister plan. "You won't have to, my sweet," he murmured, his eyes shifting toward the kitchen door. Behind that door stood Abigail Prescott. Abigail was Clara's older sister, though the town treated her more like the Prescotts' indentured servant. At 24, she was deemed unmarriageable, entirely because of the left side of her face. When they were children, Clara had knocked over an oil lamp. Abigail had thrown herself over her sister to smother the flames, suffering severe, jagged burn scars from her cheekbone down to her collarbone. Instead of gratitude, Clara viewed Abigail's scarred face as a grotesque embarrassment. The town followed suit, dubbing her the ugly Prescott. "We will send Abigail," Josiah sneered, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "We will dress her in your mother's heavy winter wedding veil. By the time that brute gets her up the mountain and discovers the switch, the storm will have hit. He won't be able to bring her back until spring, and by then, I'll have spent the gold, and he can do whatever he pleases with her." Clara laughed, a sharp, tinkling sound that sent shivers down Abigail's spine as she listened from the shadows. The sheer malice of the joke sending the scarred, unwanted daughter to a wild brute delighted them. The next morning, under the guise of a tearful farewell, a heavily veiled Abigail was forced into the passenger seat of Silas Montgomery's buckboard wagon. Beneath the thick, opaque lace, Abigail's eyes were wide with sheer terror. She had no delusions about her fate. When the mountain man discovered he had been cheated, that he had paid a fortune for the ugly sister, he would likely kill her. Or worse, throw her out into the merciless Wyoming winter to freeze. Silas did not speak as he flicked the reins. The massive draft horses lunged forward, and the wagon began its steep, arduous climb out of Bitter Creek. The temperature dropped steadily as they ascended into the jagged, snow-capped peaks. Abigail sat rigidly, the cold biting through her woolen coat, her heart hammering violently against her ribs. She waited for him to speak, to reach for the veil, but he merely kept his eyes on the treacherous winding trail. It took 10 grueling hours to reach his homestead. When the wagon finally halted, Abigail peeked through the lace. She expected a dilapidated, filthy shack. Instead, she gasped. Nestled in a clearing surrounded by ancient, towering pines was a magnificent, sprawling log cabin. Smoke curled invitingly from a massive stone chimney. The wraparound porch was neatly stacked with dry firewood, and lanterns glowed warmly through thick glass windows. Silas stepped down, his massive frame moving with surprising grace, and walked around to her side. He reached up, his large gloved hands wrapping around her waist, and lifted her down as easily as if she weighed nothing at all. He led her inside. The interior was breathtaking warm, meticulously clean, with rich Navajo rugs covering the hardwood floors, and, to Abigail's absolute shock, an entire wall lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, crammed with leather-bound volumes. "You can take off the veil now, Clara," Silas said. His voice was not a savage growl, but a deep, resonant baritone that echoed in the quiet cabin. "You must be exhausted." Abigail's breath hitched. Her hands trembled violently as she reached up. This was it, the moment of her doom. With a shaking breath, she pulled the heavy lace over her head and let it fall to the floor. She squeezed her eyes shut, turning the scarred left side of her face toward the firelight, bracing for the shout of rage, the strike of a heavy hand. Silence stretched in the room. It was thick, heavy, and suffocating. "Look at me," Silas commanded softly. Abigail opened her eyes, tears spilling hot down her cheeks. She looked up at the towering mountain man, expecting to see disgust and fury. Instead, Silas Montgomery was staring at her with a look of profound, chilling realization. His jaw tightened, a muscle feathering in his cheek as his eyes darted from her scarred face to the heavy veil on the floor. He understood instantly. "Josiah," Silas whispered, his voice turning to cold steel. It wasn't a question. He knew exactly what had been done to him. He had been mocked, cheated. Abigail fell to her knees, her hands clasped. "Please," she sobbed, abandoning her pride. "Please, Mr. Montgomery, I had no choice. My father forced me. If you throw me out into the snow, I will die. I'll cook for you. I'll clean. I'll sleep in the barn with the horses. Just please don't kill me." Silas stared down at the trembling woman. Slowly, he knelt on one knee until he was eye level with her. He reached out a massive, calloused hand. Abigail flinched, squeezing her eyes shut again, but the strike never came. Instead, the rough pad of his thumb gently wiped a tear from her unscarred cheek. "Stand up, Abigail," he said gently. She opened her eyes in shock. "You know my name?" "I know everything that happens in Bitter Creek," Silas said, rising to his feet and offering her his hand. "And I do not keep my wife in the barn." For the first 3 days, Abigail waited for the other shoe to drop. She moved around the sprawling cabin like a frightened ghost, keeping her scarred profile turned away from Silas out of deeply ingrained habit. She expected him to demand his money's worth in labor, or to treat her with the same casual cruelty she had endured her entire life in Bitter Creek. But Silas Montgomery was an enigma. He woke before dawn, slipping out into the freezing wilderness to check his trap lines and hunt. He would return mid-morning, bringing fresh game, and chop wood with terrifying rhythmic power. Yet, when he stepped inside the cabin, the savage vanished. He would wash meticulously at the basin, change into clean flannel shirts, and sit by the fire. On their 4th evening, Abigail was wiping down the heavy oak dining table after serving him a venison stew. She had barely eaten her own portion, her nerves still wired tight. "You're a remarkable cook, Abigail," Silas said suddenly, breaking the silence. He was sitting in a leather armchair, a thick volume of Charles Dickens resting on his knee. Abigail paused, her dishcloth suspended in midair. "Thank you, Mr. Montgomery." "Silas," he corrected gently. "And you don't need to hide your face from me." Abigail's hand instantly flew to her left cheek, a reflex she couldn't control. "It's unpleasant to look at," she stammered, her gaze dropping to the floorboards. "Clara always said it ruins the appetite." A dark, dangerous shadow crossed Silas's eyes at the mention of her sister's name, but he quickly masked it. He closed his book and leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "Come here," he instructed quietly. Abigail hesitated, her heart fluttering, but she slowly walked over to him. She stood before him, bathed in the golden light of the hearth. Silas reached up, and with infinite care, he took her trembling hand and pulled it away from her cheek. His eyes, the color of a stormy winter sky, scanned the jagged ridges of the burn scar. He didn't recoil. He didn't pity her. He looked at it as if he were studying a map of a hard-fought battle. "How did it happen?" he asked. "A fire," Abigail whispered. "When I was 10. Clara knocked over a lamp. I pulled her out of the way, but the oil caught my dress. Silas let out a slow, heavy breath. You saved her life, and they called you ugly for it. His voice dripped with a terrifying, quiet anger directed entirely at the Prescott family. In my eyes, Abigail, this scar is a mark of profound courage. It is far more beautiful than the hollow vanity of your sister. Abigail's breath hitched. No one had ever spoken to her like this. No one had ever looked at her and seen anything other than a tragic mistake. For the first time in 14 years, she didn't feel the urge to hide her face. As the deep winter snows sealed the mountain pass, cutting them off entirely from the world below, the rhythm of their life shifted. The fear that had gripped Abigail's heart began to thaw, replaced by a blossoming, fragile trust. She learned that Silas was not a native of the wild. He was a civil engineer from Boston, a man who had built bridges across great rivers, until the Civil War took everything from him, his brother, his faith in humanity, and his desire to be part of civilized society. He had retreated to the Wind River Range to find peace. He had gone down to Bitter Creek for a wife, because the loneliness of the mountain had finally begun to erode his spirit. He had pointed at Clara not out of lust, but because Josiah had paraded her around like a prize mare, and Silas had simply wanted to conclude the transaction quickly. They thought they were sending me a curse, Silas told her one night as they sat together on the rug before the fire, Abigail mending a tear in his coat while he read aloud to her. But Josiah Prescott is a fool. He gave me the only treasure in that town worth keeping. Abigail looked up, her heart doing a violent, painful flip. Silas was looking at her with an intensity that made the breath catch in her throat. Slowly, he reached out and traced the line of her jaw, his thumb brushing over the edge of her scar. It was the first time he had touched her with undeniable, romantic intent. He leaned in, his lips brushing hers in a tender, reverent kiss. Abigail melted into him, a soft sigh escaping her lips. The mountain man, feared by the entire territory, held her as if she were made of spun glass. But down in the valley, the town of Bitter Creek was ignorant of the paradise unfolding on the mountain. In the local saloon, Josiah Prescott bought rounds of whiskey for the townsfolk, laughing uproariously as he recounted how he had tricked the beast of the Wind River. I reckon he's either thrown her off a cliff by now, or she's frozen to death trying to walk back down, Josiah boasted, slapping his knee. Clara, dripping in new silk dresses bought with Silas's gold, simpered in agreement. They thought they had won. They thought the joke was finished. What Josiah Prescott didn't know was that Silas Montgomery was a man of immense patience, and he possessed a fortune far larger than the bag of gold he had left on the mercantile counter. When the spring thaw finally came, melting the ice that locked the mountain pass, Silas prepared to make his descent. He wasn't going down to demand his gold back. He was going down to destroy the man who had tormented the woman he loved. "Stay here, my heart," Silas told Abigail on the first morning of the thaw, strapping a heavy Colt revolver to his hip and shrugging into his dark leather duster. His eyes were cold, calculating, and utterly merciless. "I have some unfinished business in Bitter Creek. I need to teach your father a lesson about the true price of his cruelty." Abigail watched from the porch as Silas rode down the mountain, knowing that hell was about to descend on the town that had discarded her. The spring mud of Bitter Creek was thick and treacherous, but the heavy hooves of Silas Montgomery's black stallion, Midnight, cut through it with rhythmic, terrifying purpose. Silas did not look like the feral mountain man who had descended upon the town 6 months prior. Gone were the heavy bear furs and the wild, unkempt beard. In their place, he wore a tailored, charcoal gray wool suit, a crisp white shirt, and a long, dark leather duster that swept the tops of his polished riding boots. His beard was trimmed to a neat, formidable shadow along his square jaw. He looked less like a savage and more like a wealthy, dangerous Eastern Railroad baron. He did not ride toward Josiah Prescott's mercantile. Instead, he hitched his stallion in front of the Bitter Creek Bank and Trust. Inside, Jebediah Sterling, the town's nervous, balding banker, was tallying the morning's meager deposits. He barely looked up as the heavy oak door swung open, but the sheer presence of the man who stepped inside made the air in the room turn cold. "May I help you, sir?" Jebediah asked, adjusting his spectacles, entirely failing to recognize the man standing before him. Silas reached into the inner pocket of his duster and withdrew a thick leather-bound portfolio. He dropped it onto the banker's desk with a heavy, authoritative thud. "You can, Mr. Sterling. My name is Silas Montgomery. I believe you hold several outstanding promissory notes and a heavily leveraged mortgage on Josiah Prescott's mercantile and his private estate." Jebediah's face drained of color. "Montgomery? The mountain man?" He stared at the immaculate suit, the cold, calculating storm-gray eyes. "But, how do you—" "I am a civil engineer by trade, Mr. Sterling," Silas said, his voice a low, lethal purr. "Before the war, my firm held the contracts for the transcontinental rail line surveys. I hold federal bearer bonds that dwarf the entire capital of this bank." He flipped open the portfolio, revealing stacks of crisp, high-denomination bonds bearing the seal of the United States Treasury. "I am here to purchase every single cent of Josiah Prescott's debt, and I am paying in full." Jebediah swallowed hard, his trembling hands reaching for the bonds. It was an astronomical sum. "Mr. Montgomery, if I sell you these notes, you effectively own Josiah Prescott. He missed his last 3 payments. You could foreclose on him by sundown." "That," Silas said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips, "is precisely the plan." Across town, the Golden Spur Saloon was raucous with the afternoon crowd. Josiah Prescott stood at the mahogany bar, holding a crystal glass of imported bourbon, regaling the local ranchers yet again with the tale of his brilliant deception. Clara sat nearby at a poker table, fanning herself with a lace parasol, wearing a gown of emerald silk that had been paid for with Silas's gold. "I tell you, the brute didn't even lift the veil," Josiah boomed, wiping tears of mirth from his eyes. By the time he realized he had the ugly Prescott, the pass was snowed in. He's probably used her as bear bait by now. The saloon doors did not swing open. They were pushed with such quiet, deliberate force that the hinges groaned in protest. The laughter died in Josiah's throat. The piano player fumbled and stopped. The entire saloon went dead silent as Silas Montgomery stepped over the threshold. Clara dropped her parasol. She stared at the man in the doorway, her mouth falling open. This couldn't be the beast from the mountain. This man was striking, imposing, radiating an aura of immense wealth and raw, unchecked power. His broad shoulders filled the frame of the doorway, and his steely gaze swept the room before locking onto Josiah. Josiah's hand immediately dropped toward the revolver at his hip, his face going pale. "Montgomery," he breathed, terror replacing his bravado. "You survived the winter." "I thrive in the winter, Josiah," Silas said, his voice echoing in the dead quiet room. His footsteps were heavy and measured as he walked toward the bar. The crowd parted for him like the Red Sea. "It seems you have been telling tales, celebrating a clever bargain." Josiah backed away, bumping into the brass rail of the bar. "Now listen here, Silas. A deal is a deal. You paid for a bride, and I gave you one. The transaction is complete." "Oh, I entirely agree," Silas replied, stopping 5 feet from the trembling merchant. "You gave me a bride. A woman of unparalleled grace, courage, and beauty. You gave me Abigail." Clara scoffed loudly from the corner, breaking the silence. She stood up, smoothing her emerald skirts, suddenly seeing an opportunity. If this man was wealthy, and clearly cleaned up well, perhaps she had made a terrible mistake. She put on her most seductive, pouty smile and swayed toward him. "Mr. Montgomery," Clara purred, placing a delicate hand on his arm. "My father was terribly cruel to play such a trick on a gentleman like yourself. Abigail is a broken, scarred thing. If you've come back to trade her in, I am ready to fulfill our original arrangement." The entire saloon held its breath. The sheer audacity of the girl was staggering. Silas looked down at Clara's hand, resting on his sleeve. His expression did not change, but his eyes turned to chips of glacial ice. Slowly, deliberately, he reached over and removed her hand as if it were a diseased insect. "Do not touch me," Silas said, his voice dropping an octave. Clara recoiled as if she had been slapped. Silas turned his attention back to the horrified father. "I did not come down from my mountain to return my wife. I came to inform you of a change in your circumstances, Josiah." Silas reached into his duster and pulled out a thick sheaf of legal documents, stamped with the seal of the Bitter Creek Bank. He threw them onto the damp wood of the bar. "What is this?" Josiah stammered, his hand shaking as he picked up the papers. "Those are the deeds to your mercantile, the mortgage on your home, and the promissory notes for every outstanding debt you owe," Silas declared loudly, ensuring every person in the room could hear. "I bought them all an hour ago from Jeb Sterling, and as of this moment, Josiah, I am calling in your debts, all of them, in full, immediately." Josiah's eyes bulged. "That's impossible. It's thousands of dollars. You don't have that kind of money. You're a savage living in a dirt shack. I am a man who built the bridges you cross and the railroads that bring your goods," Silas corrected coldly. "And you have exactly 1 hour to vacate my property, both the store and the house. Leave the silk," he added, glancing with profound disgust at Clara. "You bought it with my gold. It belongs to me." "You can't do this!" Clara shrieked, her beautiful face twisting into an ugly, desperate snarl. "We'll be ruined! We'll be out on the street!" "You threw your own flesh and blood to the wolves, Clara," Silas said, turning on his heel. "Consider this the bite. Desperation makes men foolish." And Josiah Prescott was the most desperate man in the Wyoming Territory. As Silas Montgomery walked out of the Golden Spur Saloon, leaving the town of Bitter Creek in a state of absolute shock, Josiah slipped out the back door into the muddy alleyway. He wasn't going to lose everything. He refused to let his scarred, discarded daughter become the wife of a millionaire while he starved in the gutters. Josiah sprinted toward the livery stable. He knew a man who slept in the hayloft there, a ruthless drifter and hired gun named Hiram Cobb. Cobb was a man with a long ledger of blood, wanted in 3 territories, and known to do anything for the right price. "Cobb!" Josiah hissed, violently shaking the sleeping outlaw awake. "I have a job for you. $500 in gold." The man in the black duster walking toward the telegraph office. "I want him dead before he reaches the porch." Hiram Cobb sat up, a wicked, gold-toothed grin spreading across his unwashed face. He casually checked the cylinders of his twin Colt revolvers. "Consider him a ghost, Prescott." Meanwhile, miles above the town, Abigail paced the length of the heavy Navajo rug in the mountain cabin. The fire crackled, but it brought her no warmth. A deep, agonizing dread had settled in her stomach the moment Silas rode away. She knew her father better than anyone. Josiah was a cornered rat, and cornered rats always bite. He would never surrender his pride or his property without a treacherous fight. Unable to bear the suffocating anxiety, Abigail made a decision. She threw on her heavy riding cloak, rushed to the stables, and saddled Silas's spare horse, a sturdy roan mare. She didn't care about the freezing wind or the treacherous mud. She had spent 24 years hiding from the world, cowering from her family's cruelty. Silas had shown her she was brave. It was time to prove it. She kicked the mare into a dangerous breakneck gallop down the winding mountain trail. Back in Bitter Creek, Silas stood in the center of the muddy thoroughfare, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit. "Montgomery!" The shout echoed off the wooden storefronts. Silas turned slowly. Standing 30 yards away, blocking the street, was Hiram Cobb. His hands hovered over his holsters, his stance wide. To Cobb's left, hiding half behind a wooden water trough, was Josiah Prescott, his face pale and slick with panicked sweat. The street cleared instantly. Townspeople scrambled into alleyways and dived behind rain barrels. "I hear you're a rich man, Montgomery," Cobb sneered, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the mud. "But all the federal bonds in the world won't stop a .45 caliber slug. Draw your iron." Silas didn't flinch. His face remained carved from granite. "I have no quarrel with you, Cobb. Walk away. Prescott here paid me to make sure you don't leave town breathing," Cobb laughed. "Nothing personal." Suddenly, the frantic drumming of hooves shattered the tense silence. A roan mare slid to a chaotic, mud-splattering halt at the edge of town. Abigail practically threw herself from the saddle. Her riding hood fell back, exposing the scarred left side of her face to the afternoon sun. "Silas!" she screamed, her voice tearing through the quiet street. Silas's eyes widened for a fraction of a second, a flash of pure terror for her safety crossing his stoic features. "Abigail, stay back!" Josiah saw his daughter, and his fear morphed into blinding, irrational rage. "You!" he bellowed, stepping out from behind the trough, drawing a small, concealed derringer from his waistcoat. "This is your fault, you scarred, worthless witch! I should have drowned you!" Josiah leveled the derringer directly at Abigail. It happened in the span of a single heartbeat. Cobb, seeing Silas's distraction, drew his revolvers with lightning speed. But Silas had survived the bloodiest battlefields of the Civil War. He drew his heavy Colt, not aiming at the hired gun but at Josiah. He fired a single, deafening shot. The bullet shattered Josiah's right shoulder, spinning the older man around and sending the derringer flying into the mud. Josiah collapsed, screaming in agony. Simultaneously, Cobb fired. The bullet grazed the sleeve of Silas's heavy duster, tearing through the wool but missing flesh. Before Cobb could fan the hammer for a second shot, the booming report of a Winchester rifle echoed from the sheriff's office. Sheriff Tobias Miller stepped onto the boardwalk, his rifle smoking, aimed directly at Cobb's chest. "Drop them, Hiram," Sheriff Miller ordered, his voice echoing with the authority of the law. "You too, Josiah. I saw the whole thing. Hiring a gun and aiming at an unarmed woman. That's a hanging offense." Cobb slowly lowered his weapons, cursing. Sheriff Miller motioned for his deputies to clap them both in irons. Silas holstered his weapon. He didn't look at Josiah, who was sobbing in the mud, nor at Clara, who stared in horror from the saloon steps. Silas walked straight to Abigail. She was trembling as the adrenaline crashed. Silas reached her, his massive hands gently framing her face. Right there, in the middle of the street, under the judging eyes of the town that had tormented her, Silas leaned down and pressed a long, passionate kiss to the jagged scar on her cheek. "I told you to stay on the mountain, my queen," he murmured. "I couldn't let you face them alone," Abigail whispered. "You are my home now, Silas." Silas turned, wrapping a protective arm around her. He looked at the gathered townsfolk. "Let it be known," his voice boomed. "The Prescotts are finished in Bitter Creek. If any man or woman speaks a cross word to my wife again, I will not use my money to ruin them. I will use my hands." He lifted Abigail onto his stallion, mounting behind her, shielding her from the wind. Silas Montgomery turned his horse back toward the majestic peaks. They rode out of Bitter Creek, leaving behind a shattered legacy of cruelty, ascending back to their fortress in the clouds. What an incredible story of ultimate revenge and true love. Josiah and Clara thought they could throw Abigail away like trash, but Silas saw the queen she truly was. Sometimes, the cruelest jokes lead to the most beautiful destinies. Did you love seeing the town get exactly what they deserved? Drop a comment below with your favorite moment. Hit that like button. Share this incredible story with your friends. And make sure to subscribe for more epic Wild West romances.